It's chapter 19, and I've kind of been dreading talking about this chapter. Let's figure out why. Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. '19 opens with Kathy and Ruth making their way to Kingsfield, where Tommy is staying at a recovery center after his first donation. Here, Ishiguro gives a lot of insight into the world of these characters. Two big observations I want you to think about as you finish the novel. First, how places in the novel change. I'll talk more about this in my final video, but it's worth taking notice of it now. Tommy's run-down, drafty recovery center that doesn't even have the plumbing to accommodate all these patients used to be a family vacation center, where kids and their parents once swimmed and had adventures, is now a den for the dying. The pool has now become the square, a cement rectangle in the earth with the skeleton of a diving board rising out of it. The second observation comes from comparing Tommy and Ruth's recovery centers. Obviously, Tommy's is terrible, but Ruth's seems nice, for what it is anyway. This discrepancy in conditions reminds me of Hailsham. Throughout the novel, other characters have been in awe of Tommy, Ruth, and Kathy's connection to the school. This shows that most clones, in their formative years, are in for a far different experience. At the end of the first section of the chapter, Kathy, Tommy, and Ruth are reunited for the first time in 7 years. Kathy describes their first interaction as follows on 220. Ruth stayed where she was, and that was why, when Tommy came up to us, his gaze fell on me, and why it was me he hugged first. I could smell a faint odor of something medicinal on him, which I couldn't identify. Then, though we hadn't yet said anything to each other, we both sensed Ruth watching us from the car and pulled away. So I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same. As the three of them drive toward the boat, things start off well. The sun is shining, a rare occurrence in this part of England, and Kathy remarks on how the three of them seem to be able to pick their friendship right back up. There's some obvious negatives, Tommy's casual remark about the bleeding that's kept him inside. But Kathy's narration moves right past that, bleeding stitches being nothing outside of the ordinary in her line of work, and gives us a description of one of the most uncomfortable sections in the entire novel. Then, a little further on, as we continued across the empty countryside, Ruth turned right round in her seat until she was facing Tommy, and just kept looking at him. She still had on her little smile, but said nothing, and I could see in my mirror Tommy looking distinctly uncomfortable. He kept looking out the window beside him, then back at her, then back out the window again. After a while, without taking her gaze off him, Ruth started on a rambling anecdote about someone or other, a donor at her center, someone we'd never heard of, and all the time she kept looking at Tommy, the gentle smile never leaving her face. Perhaps because I was getting bored by her anecdote, perhaps because I wanted to help Tommy out, I interrupted after a minute or so, saying, "Yeah, okay, we don't need to hear every last thing about her." I said this without any malice, and really hadn't intended anything by it. But even before Ruth paused, almost as I was still speaking, Tommy made a sudden laughing noise, a kind of explosion, a noise I'd never heard him make before, and he said, "That's exactly what I was about to say. I lost track of it a while ago." My eyes were on the road, so I wasn't sure if he'd addressed me or Ruth. In any case, Ruth stopped talking and slowly turned back in her seat until she was facing the front again. She didn't seem particularly upset, but the smile had gone and her eyes looked far away, fixed somewhere on the sky ahead of us. But I have to be honest, at that instant, I wasn't really thinking about Ruth. My heart had done a little leap, because in a single stroke, with that little laugh of agreement, it felt as though Tommy and I had come close together again after all these years. So the love triangle is still alive and well, and of course any progress in Tommy and Kathy's relationship has to come at Ruth's expense. But Ruth takes all this without so much as a retort. In this sense, she reminds me of Laura from the previous chapter, a once lively character whose spirit the world has broken. As the three leave the car and begin the trudge into the woods, it becomes evident that Ruth suffers from more than just a broken spirit. The walk to the boat isn't particularly strenuous, at least not for Tommy or Kathy, but the trail and the fence paralyze Ruth with genuine fear. And then we get one of the most touching moments of the entire novel. Then we came to a barbed wire fence, which was tilted and rusted, the wire itself yanked all over the place. When Ruth saw it, she came to an abrupt halt. "Oh no," she said anxiously. Then she turned to me. "You didn't say anything about this. You didn't say we had to get past barbed wire." "It's not going to be difficult," I said. "We can go under it. We just have to hold it for each other." But Ruth looked really upset and didn't move. And it was then, as she stood there, her shoulders rising and falling with her breathing, that Tommy seemed to become aware for the first time just how frail she was. Maybe he'd noticed before and hadn't wanted to take it in, but now he stared at her for a good few seconds. Then I think what happened next, though of course I can't know for certain, was that the both of us, Tommy and I, we remembered what had happened in the car, when we'd more or less ganged up on her. And almost as an instinct, we both went to her. I took an arm, Tommy supported her elbow on the other side, and we began gently guiding her towards the fence. I let go of Ruth only to pass through the fence myself. Then I held up the wire as high as I could, and Tommy and I both helped her through. It wasn't so difficult for her in the end. It was more of a confidence thing, and with us there for support, she seemed to lose her fear of the fence. On the other side, she actually made a go of helping me hold up the wire for Tommy. And here's where one of the main themes of the novel, or at least the titular theme, comes through. Ruth is easy to hate. Neither Kathy nor Tommy had to interact with her ever again. And when a person's health is failing, those around them can often feel uncomfortable, or perhaps even want to distance themselves. That's why being a hospice worker is such a noble and difficult profession. In the wise words of Death Cab for Cutie, love is watching someone die. Being around death reminds us of our own temporal existence. And with Tommy already starting donations and Kathy knowing full well what path this road goes down, it must be an extremely difficult thing to watch their childhood friend waste away. And yet, here they all are, holding on to each other, literally never letting go. Eventually, Kathy and the others find the boat, and it's in this section of the text, page 224 in my book, where we're met with this unusual image. I'm not sure what Ishiguro wants us to make of this boat, but if we read the page closely, we can see that each of the three characters react to this scene quite differently. If you know where I'm talking about in the novel, I want you to take a second to reread it again and notice the different reactions of Tommy, Kathy, and Ruth. And then, pause the video or something, because in a second I'm going to give you my interpretation of it. Alright, so as you can see, different characters can see things very differently. And it's particularly interesting because Ishiguro has given us a book full of characters who are experts in interpreting art. They've been studying it since a very early age at Hailsham. But I want to focus, at least for now, on Tommy's interpretation of what he sees. You see, because of Tommy's comments, everyone is soon reminiscing about Hailsham. Before long, their talk goes from the building to the people, specifically those undergoing donations. Soon, Ruth brings up Chrissy, the girl from the cottages who went to Norfolk with them, the girl who obsessed over deferrals. Ruth tells us on 225, "I heard about Chrissy. I heard she completed during her second donation." "I heard that as well," said Tommy. "It must be right. I heard exactly the same. A shame, only her second as well. Glad that didn't happen to me." "I think it happens much more than they ever tell us," Ruth said. "My carer over there, she probably knows that's right, but she won't say." "There's no big conspiracy about it," I said, turning back to the boat. "Sometimes it happens. It was really sad about Chrissy, but that's not common. They're really careful these days." I find this interesting because we see a real divide between Ruth, the donor, and Kathy, the carer. I mean, Ruth was a carer at one point, but now that she's not, she no longer trusts them. And this section of the chapter ends with a lot of debate. How Rodney must have felt when he heard about Chrissy completing. How they decide when to send your first notice to begin donations. Why they move donors around the country so much. But at the end of all this, they don't seem too worked up about the future. In a way, they've been preparing for it all their lives. They then leave the boat, glad to have had the chance to see it. The way back to the car goes well, but the good mood soon fades when Kathy and Tommy again gang up on Ruth, this time about a poster or billboard on the side of the road. The poster, to Kathy at least, resembles the magazine, with a woman in an office, the same setting where Ruth thought her possible might be. Ruth clearly wants to ignore this embarrassing association. I mean, it symbolizes the false hope she had about her future, and Kathy is observant enough to realize this, but her and Tommy just won't let it go. In one page, they tell Ruth that she should have pursued her dreams more 9 times. And for the first time in the novel, I find myself feeling bad for Ruth. Here she is, just a shell of her former spirit, dying from her donations, and she's being berated about how foolish she was both to dream of a future and to not have pursued this future harder. The only flash of the old Ruth we've seen in this section is when the three of them are discussing Chrissy's death on 226, and Ruth condemns Rodney's reaction. Kathy starts by saying, "Actually," I said, "he wasn't too bad about it. He was sad, obviously, but he was okay. They hadn't seen each other for a couple of years anyway. He said he thought Chrissy wouldn't have minded too much. And I suppose he should know." "Why would he know?" Ruth said. "How could he possibly know what Chrissy would have felt? What she would have wanted? It wasn't him on that table trying to cling on to life. How would he know?" And you know, as much as I don't like Ruth or even Chrissy, that's how I feel too. That death shouldn't just be passively accepted just because it's inevitable. Anyway, we see another flash of the old Ruth when Kathy trips up and mentions Madame. But just as Kathy is bracing for an attack, Ruth asks for forgiveness. Forgiveness for lying about her own urges for physical intimacy. For cheating on Tommy multiple times. And then, with Tommy sitting in the back seat, experiencing what must be one of the most awkward car rides in all of 21st century literature, Ruth asks Kathy to forgive her for keeping the two of them, Kathy and Tommy, apart. But more than that, Ruth wants to give them something. A chance. By this point, Kathy is crying, refusing to even acknowledge the possibility, but Tommy seems intrigued, and so Ruth gives him a piece of paper with Madame's address. She explains, "It's Madame's address. It's like you were saying to me just now. You've at least got to try." "How'd you find it?" Tommy asked. "It wasn't easy. It took me a long time, and I ran a few risks. But I got it in the end. And I got it for you two. Now it's up to you to find her and try." And so, Ruth goes to great trouble to get the address that she hopes might give Tommy and Kathy a chance at a deferral from future donations. At the end of the trip, Kathy is still numb to the idea, but Tommy walks away with a smile. In a little while after the trip, Kathy and Ruth are smiling too. Kathy details this on 235. "All the guardedness, all the suspicions between me and Ruth evaporated, and we seemed to remember everything we'd once meant for each other. And that was the start of it, that era with the summer coming on and Ruth's health at least on an even keel, when I'd come in the evenings with biscuits and mineral water, and we'd sit side by side at her window, watching the sun go down over the roofs, talking about Hailsham, the cottages, anything that drifted into our minds. When I think about Ruth now, of course, I feel sad she's gone, but I also feel really grateful for that period we had at the end." The ending of that paragraph comes as quite a shock. We've spent 235 pages with Ruth, and she's gone in a sentence. And that can come off as if Kathy is cold or uncaring, but I don't think that at all. She re-enters her friend's life to be by her side for the end of it, to never let her go. And it's while she hangs on to Ruth in her dying hours that Kathy promises to fulfill Ruth's wish and become Tommy's donor, to give it a try. We'll see how that works out in the final chapters. Thanks for watching.